Front-end engineering salaries grow quickly at the beginning. $100,000, $120,000, $140,000, and then something changes. Progress slows, movement becomes harder. And for many engineers, $150,000 becomes difficult to pass. Not impossible, but consistently difficult. And that consistency is the signal, because it is not random, it is structural. At first, front-end looks like a high-growth path, modern frameworks, high demand, constant evolution, and visible impact. Everything users interact with passes through front-end, which makes the role feel central. And early in a career, that translates into fast growth. You improve, you ship features, you see immediate results, and compensation follows. But over time, the structure reveals itself, because front-end is built around interfaces, user-facing layers, presentation logic. And while that work is important, it behaves in a specific way. It is highly distributable. You can split features across engineers. You can divide components. You can parallelize development. And when work can be distributed like that, individual leverage decreases. Because the system does not depend on one person. It depends on many. And when value is distributed, compensation stabilizes. This is where the slowdown begins, not because demand disappears, but because the role reaches its structural range. You can still improve. You can still contribute. But the system no longer assigns significantly higher value to the same type of work. This is where most engineers misread the situation. They assume more skill will break the barrier. More frameworks, more tools, more specialization. But the limitation is not technical. It is structural. Front-end roles execute defined systems. They implement designs. They build interfaces. But they rarely control system-level decisions. And that difference matters, because value concentrates around control. Who defines the architecture? Who controls performance trade-offs? Who determines how systems scale? Those layers behave differently. They are harder to distribute. They cannot be scaled by simply adding more engineers. And that is where compensation continues to expand. Not because those roles are more visible, but because they are less replaceable. Front-end work can be split. System control cannot, which creates a ceiling, one that appears gradually, but holds consistently. There is also a hidden split inside front-end. Some engineers remain in execution layers. Others move toward performance, architecture, or platform roles. And that shift changes the structure they operate in, not the title, but the function. And function determines value. This is why two front-end engineers can have similar experience, similar output, and very different compensation trajectories. Because one remains in a scalable role, and the other moves toward control. And over time, that difference compounds. But that shift is limited. You don't need many people defining front-end architecture. You don't need many people setting direction. You need a few. And that creates competition and selectivity, which reinforces the plateau. Because most engineers remain in distributable roles, and distributable roles create predictable compensation ranges. There is also a perception layer. Front-end work is highly visible. It is easier to demonstrate, easier to showcase, easier to evaluate, which makes early progression faster. But visibility does not equal leverage, and over time, that difference becomes clear. Because visible work is often easier to distribute, and distributed work stabilizes. This is why many front-end engineers approach $140,000 to $150,000 and slow down, even in strong companies, even with high demand. Because the structure remains consistent, across teams, across products, across industries. You are not just progressing in a role, you are operating inside a system, and that system defines how far the role can go. There is also a pressure layer. As compensation increases, expectations increase, tolerance for mistakes decreases, speed requirements rise, and performance expectations expand. But the structure does not expand at the same rate, which creates tension, more pressure, without proportional compensation growth, and that reinforces the plateau. This also explains why switching companies creates temporary jumps, a new environment, a different valuation, a slightly higher range, but over time, the same forces apply. Distribution, scalability, stabilization, because the role itself has not changed, only the context has. So when you see front-end salaries slowing near $150,000, you are not looking at a limit of skill, you are looking at a limit of structure, a point where scalability, distribution, and role design converge. And unless your position changes, that point tends to hold. You can keep improving, you can keep learning, But the system determines how far that translates into compensation, which is why most engineers reach that range and struggle to move beyond it, not because they can't, but because the system doesn't assign that level broadly. This is part of what I break down step by step in the $200,000 system below.